research on the socio-spatial doing vegan sociology. So we're very pleased to have a panel with Zoei Sutton, Nick Pendergrast, and Alex Hill. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Zoe.
Excellent, thank you. And welcome everyone again to day 2 of the conference. I just want to begin again by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm joining you from, which is the lands of the Kaurna people, and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. This land's stolen land, sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always was Aboriginal land. So I encourage all of you to acknowledge in the chat, if you're joining us from stolen land, the traditional owners of the land that you are joining us from. So for our panel this year, we're going to be running it pretty much like we did last year, which is an informal chat amongst the 3 of us. So I hope you like a messy ramble, because we do in Australia. The theme of our panel this year, as Corey said, is challenging anthroparchy in research on the socio-spatial doing of vegan sociology. And I think when we were talking about ideas amongst the thematic group, and initially we did have Josephine, who unfortunately is unwell, but gladly with us in the chat, so I'm sure she'll be chiming in a little bit as well. But we were really thinking about this idea that draws on the ideas underpinning the conference of space and time as socially constructed in ways that create particular social orders. And I know it's highly likely that all of us are doing our research in non-vegan contexts. A lot of us are in neoliberal universities that create challenging conditions for anyone, really, but particularly those that are seeking to do radical research that challenges dominant ideologies, and any sort of slow, deep, unthinking work, like some of those new frontiers Jessica was talking about yesterday. They need a lot of kind of thinking. We need to sit back and rethink the way that we do things and the way that we approach things. And you need time to do that. You need to be in a context that allows you the time and the space to be able to explore these ideas. And I don't know if anyone saw last year as well, Kate Stewart and Matthew Cole did this seminar at the University of Kent, which I don't think was recorded, but if it is, I would like the recording. But they did this thing where they were talking about some of the things we might think about if we wanted to pursue critical vegan sociologies. And one of the ones that they talked about, which I remember, and I can see it here, Kate, so if I ruin it, you can tell me really quick. But one of the things they talked about was challenging research institutions and the actual kind of institutions that we need to do our research, like ethics boards. And I think they're right. And this was a really important point, that we need to start thinking about and explicitly discussing the physical spaces and the material conditions that we are doing our work in as vegan sociologists. The university sector is highly casualized in a lot of the countries that we're working in. A lot of us are working in precarious jobs or unfunded PhD positions, or we're required to buy our time back so that we can do vegan sociology work, which then brings in you need to find funding to do this work so that you can buy yourself back in order to do it. And on top of all of this, we're confronted by anthroparchal power relations in everyday life, and also the increasing speed of modernity and capitalism, which sees the Western human social world so radically out of step with other animals in the broader environment that this kind of exploitation that we're studying almost seems inevitable because of these timescapes and spaces that we're working in. Which sounds pretty bleak when you lay it all out, and I feel a bit sad. But what we thought we would do today is to just start a conversation amongst the 3 of us from the thematic group about our own experiences and context of doing vegan sociology research. So we're working in the Australian Academy. We're positioned in kind of different positions, different parts of our journey, different kind of stages in our career. But really what we wanted to just do is to highlight some of the challenges and the things that help us, and hope that it might resonate with you, and give us an opportunity to think through how we might intentionally create spaces that make it easier to do vegan sociology, because easier vegan sociology is a win for all of us and hopefully for the animals eventually as well. So I'm going to get our panelists to introduce themselves, because they can do a much better job than I can. So first off, shall we start with Alex? Can you tell us who you are and a little bit about your research?
Thanks, Zoe. Yep, so I'm Alex. I'm studying my master's in Australia, and I'm co-convening this TASA group with Zoe and Josephine. So my thesis is looking at the experiences of vegan masculinity in Australia and what that can tell us about gender and species.
Great. And Nick, do you want to follow with who you are and what your research is about?
Yeah, I did have quite a bit, but I don't want to go on for 10 minutes, so maybe I'll keep it briefer. But I did want to say I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and it's great to see in the chat people joining from all around the world, and which is great to make those connections. But I think it also speaks to, and we'll get onto this later, but the smallness of our discipline, that kind of we bring together people from all around the world to kind of group together a conference rather than like in each city there being stuff like this going on. But we'll get into that later on. I guess my research comes out of my own animal activism. So when I started my PhD, I was heavily involved in animal activism. And yeah, so that was sort of questions I was asking as an activist that sort of found its way into a PhD thesis eventually. In that thesis, I did a lot of, or part of it was media analysis, particularly around live export and animal rights and animal welfare framing, which I know Roger has already raised in the previous session yesterday, those distinctions. And yeah, more recently, I've started applying that sort of framing analysis that I've done on the media to scientific literature. Around the environmental impact of veganism, and kind of using that same media framing, but applying it to scientific literature. And finally, my thesis is more around veganism and I guess different types of consumption changes for animals, whether that be free range eggs or going vegan or vegetarian or those different things. But some of my more recent research has also looked at structural change for animals and shifting towards a plant-based food system at the structural level, which I spoke about at the previous two vegan sociology conferences.
Great, thank you. Some of you might have seen me present yesterday, but my work is largely focused on social construction of non-human animals, particularly as pets, but I've also looked at animals who are constructed as pests and killable, and the attitudes of the Australian voting public towards animal-centric policies and things like that, and most recently, housing and non-human animals as well. But mostly I'm interested in how we can use species-inclusive methods and attention to those spatial elements of how we actually live with animals to try to give us insight into that manifestation of anthroparchal structures in everyday life. So I like to do a lot of going and looking at how people live with their animals, because I think that can tell us a lot, whereas often we rely on what people say about them, and often we think they're wonderful, and we're not necessarily. So I guess the second question is, what is the space that you're doing your research in? Are there kind of challenges in being a vegan researcher in the institutions and societies that you're working in? Nick, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess I wanted to start off actually talking about teaching, which is obviously related to research. But when I first started subject coordinating, like most subject coordinators, what you teach is going to be impacted by your own research. And so I've taught a lot of my teaching has been around inequalities, and typically that is gender, race, and class, but increasingly includes other issues, disability and all kinds of different inequalities. And obviously I brought in inequalities between humans and other animals. But I do remember that first time of having that thought. At the time, I was heavily involved in animal activism, like, will that be a problem? Will it be seen as bias? And then I was also thinking about, well, the human rights researchers don't have that same problem. Like, I was sort of connected with the human rights activists at my university, and it was like, they're an academic and they're also part of Amnesty International, and that was never controversial. It was kind of assumed or viewed as a positive thing. And I guess I was kind of reflecting that from a sociological perspective, that it's not a problem advocating for social change within universities, but where it's more likely to be viewed as biased or controversial is where you don't have the society on side. And so I guess if you're making minor changes for animals, maybe you're part of the RSPCA or something, and you're talking about humane slaughter and these kind of just everyday common sense, widely accepted views, it's not controversial. So I guess I was kind of thinking about that sort of tension from teaching and how it be viewed and that kind of thing. And I guess moving on to my research, I recently spoke at my university at a sociology salon series about issues around plant-based food systems and those kind of issues. And I think that overall people are supportive of that research, but I guess also it is quite niche. So people might be like, oh, that's really interesting and kind of engaging with and really supportive, but you're probably less likely to go, oh, I'm also working this area. Can you work with me? So again, I've felt like everyone's really supportive and open to discussing and that kind of, it says recordings Okay, recording stopped and is in progress. So we might have lost a split second there, but I'm sure it wasn't too important. But yeah, I'm working with my friend and colleague, Adam Cardellini, who's an ecologist working in the sciences. And yeah, as I spoke about yesterday, he's looking at the science of it, but I'm looking at the framing and kind of bringing a social science angle to the literature around the environmental impact of vegan things not like it. Okay. But I guess the other, objection that we might get is that, we're talking about this literature, but we are both pro-vegan, we are both vegans. And it kind of reminds me of discussions around compassionate conservation. I don't know if anyone's within those spaces, but looking at preserving ecosystems, but also in a way that values the individuals within those ecosystems, so sort of influenced by more animal rights ideas rather than talking about like slaughtering animals for ecological reasons, those kind of things. And from people within that field, it's not my field, but I've been to conferences about it and that kind of thing. They've said it's much harder to get those articles published because it's dismissed as subjective, but more mainstream forms of conservation, which often promoting the killing of individuals for the sake of supposedly for environmental grounds, they're equally subjective. It's just a different point of view. But again, because it's a dominant point of view, it's seen as objective and is much easier to get stuff published on that sort of mainstream form of conservation. So yeah, I guess they're some of the issues which we deal with in sociology, but also I think we'll get more new issues and perhaps similar issues as well, looking at into the sciences as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Absolutely. I had a follow-up question because you're working in the research space and you mentioned that you'd presented at something. When you publish something new, is the uni really keen to promote your work? Like, do you have those avenues available to you?
I think probably that's, that they may well be. It's probably just my lack of self-promotion, I guess. I haven't really tried, but yeah, certainly presenting my research at my university, everyone was really supportive and thought it was really interesting, and we had some good discussions and that kind of thing. So I would imagine they'd be supportive. I haven't tried to really promote anything, but yeah, again, every experience I've had with colleagues at the university has been positive about my research and positive about me guest lecturing on animal issues and that kind of thing. So yeah, again, it's been supportive, but I haven't met too many people within the similar space doing similar work.
And I'm interested in the teaching side of things as well, because I teach kind of across a few different levels. And I know I can see Kate's got a comment in here about exposing students to vegan sociology as well. And I find because it is seen as like a niche thing, we have kind of a sociology undergraduate program, right, where they learn the sociological canon, they learn quite a bit about gender and things like that. And animal sociology is often not embedded in a course unless, I guess, the vegan sociologist is teaching it. So by the time you get a student in third year, or if you get them in an animal course or in honours year, they don't necessarily have all of that background knowledge. Like, I don't think they have as much opportunity to build that up. Do you find that with your students? Like, are you kind of the ring in for 1 week and then you go away again, or do they have an opportunity to build up that knowledge?
Yeah, I think it generally, when I have taught about that stuff, it has been something new for the students. But yeah, I felt like that they definitely engage with it. But I've also felt that the focus on the climate is kind of so big for younger people today. So I guess when I've given my most recent guest lecture, I spoke about that that intersection of the environmental impact of animal agriculture and sort of the framing and messages and plant-based food systems and those kind of issues. So I was kind of, in a way, trying to meet students where they are, but still talking about my vegan sociology. But yeah, it does seem like it's something new for the students. But again, I feel like they're definitely into it and happy to engage with it and have different views on it. But it doesn't feel like it's this really out there thing. It feels like something that, at least in my experience, that they're happy to engage with and discuss.
Absolutely. I might jump in the middle if it's okay with you, Alex, and then I'm going to ask you about your PhD experiences. Because I feel like since I finished my PhD, I've been in a bunch of research only roles. So you kind of get brought in on grant funded research. And if you want to do anything else with your time, you have to be able to buy back your research, which creates a really interesting problem in that, firstly, you have to find someone who will fund you to do critical animal research, which, as you can imagine, is challenging. And I'm sure some of you have done it or tried to do it. And it's difficult to find people who are like, yes, vegan research, my favorite. and also don't want to kind of influence the findings in any way or anything like that. So you have to be able to buy your time back, but also show the people that you're working for that it's meaningful for them in some way. Like you have to convince people that they should release you to do this work. And I think that's really difficult if you're working in contexts that don't necessarily value vegan sociology, vegan work. I've been in a few different departments. So I'm in a really wonderful department at the moment, luckily, because this is being recorded. But I've been in a whole lot of different places. I've been in business schools and economic schools and politics departments and government departments and humanities and non-humanities. And it can really depend on where you are, whether or not your research is supported in different ways. And this can even be stuff like when they ask you, if you published anything new that they want to promote, if you send in a vegan sociology piece, does it make it out into the Twitter feed or into the newsletter, or is it kind of conveniently forgotten and left off because it's not necessarily in line with what they usually do? Or are you going places where there's meat served at all of the events that you go in, and then you're that vegan person everywhere you go? And they're like, oh, that's right, there's that one animal person that comes in, but you're not necessarily integrated in, and you're not necessarily amongst people who have similar beliefs. And I always remember, this is such a small thing, but it's stuck in my mind, that when I was doing my PhD research, I was in this office where there was about, not a meter square, but there was this really heavy chunk of bird spikes. I'm not sure if you'll have bird spikes everywhere, but we have kind of spikes put up outside of windows to stop birds from landing on them. And this is a very sad story. We had bird spikes right outside our window, and there was a skeleton on some of them. And as I was sitting trying to do this critical animal studies research project, every day I would just look out at these spikes and the birds flying around that couldn't land on them and the skeleton. And you just think about the fact that you're in this institution that has these very explicitly anthroparchal things everywhere, let alone the ethics boards that don't really care about animals or any other institutions. And it's just kind of this constant reminder that, I can't think of a nice way to say it, but in a very Australian way, you're kind of pushing shit uphill. Like you're in a context where you're pushing back on everything all of the time, including in your everyday life. That I think can make it really tricky to do your vegan sociology if you manage to get it funded and convince people to do it. But anyway, Alex, you're a master's student. We've not scared you off the academy yet. You're doing excellent work. What is it like for you?
We'll see how we go.
What's the space that you're working in?
There's so much here. Like right when you sent this question through, there's just so much that comes to mind. I remembered, first of all, when I was doing my undergrad, there was a vegetarian society at my uni back then. I think, unfortunately, it's since dissolved, but they were running a talk on whether fish feel pain. And they had a local animal cognition scientist come in to do the talk, and about halfway through the discussion, he revealed that as part of his research, he killed the fish. And I sort of asked, like, how do you rationalize doing that? Because ostensibly your research is to try and help fish. And his response was, oh, well, actually, I'm going to save a lot more fish that I'm killing in the lab. And so I think that wasn't sociology back then, but I think that really spoke to a feeling that I have nowadays at my university. And I suspect a lot of universities, even people that seem so close to getting it, just don't. I think I'm the only vegan in my department. There are a few vegetarians. The closest vegans that I know of are in geography and in philosophy, which I suspect is probably similar across a few other universities as well. My department are fantastic. They're very supportive, but there's always this labor that you have to do before ever discussing vegan sociology, I feel like. Before I get to the point where I discuss what my topic's actually about, I have to sell them on veganism. And that's just so much work. I remember submitting my literature review, and I think half of it was just veganism, and the rest of it was my topic. And everyone else who was submitting the same thing submitted a review that was just their topic. And it's difficult. I mean, it's not the hardest thing in the world, I don't like to complain too much, but just that little bit of extra elbow grease, I feel like, is needed to be able to discuss vegan sociology with people who don't seem to get it or care sometimes, even when so many other issues are discussed more freely. So it's tricky. I really resonate with what both of you are saying, though I'm not in a context where I'm teaching or getting research through. I'm very fortunate in that my research is part of a thesis that I can freely work on myself. But I remember when I presented my research the first time at uni, the very first question I got was something like, how can you justify being vegan and publishing it? Surely it's biased. And clearly there's not the realization there that, oh, well, hold on, like who's been publishing this research prior? what have their motives had to do with what sort of research is produced? What sort of knowledges are we creating in our institutions? So, I mean, I keep coming back to this thing. It's tricky, isn't it? And, you know, structurally, our department floor isn't very friendly to animals and other species. Often birds come in, and because there aren't windows that can open because, for whatever reason, they get trapped in there. So you have to open a door and wait for them to fly out. And gosh, there's all sorts of stuff, isn't there?
There is. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned around presenting your research, because this is, and Nick will relate to this as well, when we started the Australian sociology group that we're representing on this panel, Nick was one of the people who started the group with me, because we were at their annual conference and there was just never an animal group for us to go to. So Nick would end up in activism, and me doing my pets research, I often ended up in like families and relationships and things. And you'd just be this random other person. And particularly because, I mean, as you say, you have to justify veganism. I have to justify pets are an exploitative relationship, and I don't support any kind of breeding, and this doesn't fit in our kind of vegan futures, which is a hard sell at an animal conference. So I found even going to animal conferences sometimes was really difficult, because as soon as you say pets, people want to talk about their dogs and their cats, and I've seen all your dogs and I'm really excited to see them. But it's really hard to take them there. As you said, people who are almost there saying, it's really great that you love your dog. This is where I'm starting from. And they just look at you like, you have lost the plot. What are you doing here, crazy vegan person? Don't be here with your like anti-pet attitudes pretending that you like animals. So I kind of found that to even have these conversations, we had to make our own spaces really early on. Like we made the TASA animals group so that we could have places to go in the pandemic. You know, Corey and I, we made this group so we had people to talk to. And it feels like that extra labor you have to do to find your people. As you both said, you don't necessarily have people in your department. If you want to have people, you have to go and find them or make a place where they can gather so that you can have friends, which feels like it sounds a bit tragic to say out loud, but it's that extra labor again that you're talking about. So yes, absolutely. I definitely resonate with that. I feel like I wrote a question down for you and now I've talked past it because I got too obsessed with the sound of my own voice.
Can I jump in about the TASA thing? If you,
yeah.
I guess I just, I think like this group is great and the TASA group is great as well. But I guess like we can also do both things of having these spaces where we can have these discussions without that long justification, which Alex was talking about. But I also kind of see the benefit of kind of reaching those other people who aren't on board as well, as much as it can be a bit more labor and that kind of thing. I remember like being in the activist group and talking about animal issues and even just sort of reframing some of the language that had been used in the conference already, and sort of talking about lambs rather than lamb, and just little changes like that, and kind of just seeing a few light globe moments for people in the audience who didn't necessarily change their perspective. But again, I really think these spaces are important to kind of legitimize the discipline and that kind of thing. But I think we can also find ways to engage and reach people outside of these spaces as well. I guess it's important to do both.
Absolutely. So Alex, in your spaces where you said they've been sort of receptive to your presentations, right? But you do have to do that extra legwork first. Does anything help you to sort of connect with the people around you, or is there anything they do that's supportive? Do you have to kind of find all of your own connections and ideas and things like that, or is there a supportive network anywhere?
That is a good question. My department are fantastic. I'm the only vegan in there, but they have been so supportive to me. In fact, like I think it was one of my professors that linked me up with IAVS, which is fantastic. So I don't want to I don't want to mischaracterize my relationship with them. I suppose just communication has been the easiest thing for me. Like, it's been very easy as someone doing a thesis, which is in many ways quite an individual task, quite isolating sometimes. It's been very easy for me to wake up some days and just go, oh, I might stay in bed today. I might not go on campus, but actually being there, and I mean, it seems a bit silly to say, but just talking to people has made it easier. In the past year, there have been multi-species reading groups established. There have been talks scheduled on veganism, and I don't know if those would have happened if I hadn't been there and had the chance to create those moments with other people. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it seems a little bit silly just saying that hanging around at university, being able to have those conversations, those moments with people is an antidote to all this. But in some ways, it has been for me.
Mhm. Do you think part of that is like when you hang around a university, you get to have those incidental conversations? I've just gone way off questions now, but you get to have those sort of incidental conversations with people that give them time to digest what you're on about. So at first it seems quite radical and out there, but over time they see that, you know, you're Alex and you're nice and you're saying things that make sense.
I think definitely. I think there's definitely something to be said for establishing rapport. But that doesn't feel right, does it? It feels like we shouldn't have to establish rapport. This is the way it is, and they have to deal with it. But it does make it so much easier. If I'm friends with this person and I start to talk about veganism, I feel like they're going to be a lot more receptive to me. And that's the way it feels like it is at my university. I'm not sure if the experience is different elsewhere.
And I guess like jumping on from that, I've heard some, this is on a completely different topic, but I've heard like discussions around sort of pseudoscience and conspiratorial views in the vegan movement and those kind of things, and how people often, you know, all of us like take shortcuts and go, well, I don't have time looking at the evidence, so I'll trust that person. And so I guess the idea about whatever the issue is of trying to, you know, convince people of a different point of view, whatever it is, of like just being a nice person in their life kind of makes that shortcut in a way. And like, oh, veganism doesn't seem so bad because Alex seems like a nice person. So like that kind of, is a way to kind of get through to people in a way, like those shortcuts that we all make in terms of like weighing up different information and ideas.
Absolutely. And I'd be interested to see, I know we have a few people here as well that do research on kind of veganism and like looking specifically at animals, or one or the other or both. And I wonder if there is kind of differences in the experiences of people who are studying animals in everyday life and people who are studying veganism. Because one of the things I come up against quite a lot, which is partially maybe the topics that I teach in as well and the research spaces that I'm in, but as soon as people hear that you're doing animal sorts of research, and again, the people who are almost there, who really love their animals, animal-assisted therapy comes up almost every time, or something that's adjacent to animal-assisted therapy. And I feel like that always puts you in that space of the, you know, the almost caring for animals that then you have to navigate in a way that's really tricky, particularly for people who aren't versed in animal rights or maybe have a different focus. You have to have really uncomfortable conversations, and you have to decide if you're going to draw a line and say, well, actually, we would never look at animal-assisted therapy. We're not interested in having that conversation. That's part of this exploitative relations. Or do you try to salvage relationships? And I think some of those things are really tricky to navigate as well around looking at animals. Anyway, we do have other questions that I'm just getting sidetracked on. You mentioned time, Nick, and I'm wondering how both of you find time to do your vegan sociology. Do you have to work it around other stuff, or is it part of your job? How does it actually fit in your life?
Do you want to take that, Alex, or do you want me to jump in first? Or
I'm happy to.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I think my answer will be fairly short though, because I'm in a program right now where effectively all my time is supposed to be dedicated to looking at this research problem. So unlike having to juggle service and teaching and research at the one time, I'm quite fortunate. Having said that, and I feel like there's always that sort of catechism at the end, but I'm just spending more time than ever now dealing with university bureaucracy. And I know that's not an issue specific to sociology. I know that's something that's happening across all the disciplines, but in a world where like unis are increasingly run for profit and my degree is increasingly treated as some sort of product that I'm supposed to come at the end with my stamp and just go off into the big wide world and get a job in industry, it's just tricky to do any sort of work. There are so many people that are struggling because of this. And again, that's why I think networks are really important. So yes, I'm in a position where I'm very fortunate to be dedicating all my time to this research. So time isn't relatively, it's not a big issue for me, but there's still pressures. And those pressures, I think, you discussed so before, the neoliberalization of universities is a huge issue that continues to impact us all. Yikes.
Yeah, I guess for me, I've outside of my PhD where I was on like the scholarship thing, I've never got any funding for research. So I've always been just on casual teaching positions. I'm on a periodic position at the moment, which has been much better, but it is still teaching only. So yeah, it's definitely a huge barrier for me. And even the article I'm working on with Adam, which I spoke about yesterday, we've been working on it for quite a few years. We have got all the data done, but it's really hard to find, hard to find time to write amongst the teaching commitments, particularly when you're, again, not being paid for the writing. So yeah, it's kind of really hard to just do that ongoing work that doesn't have a particular due date. I find, again, writing for the book that, some of us will be a part of soon, like having that deadline can be really useful, but there's not necessarily that time to kind of fit it in. It's just a general thing you do throughout the week without it being part of what you're funded for. And the final point, and I have banged on about this at, I think yesterday and previous conference as well, but I think the financial aspects for those on casual positions or periodic positions is a big issue. And it does become the thing of like, do I want to attend this conference and pay $500 out of my own pocket when you don't have a lot of money and it's not, covered by your university or research? It's just, it's just a bit of it's a ridiculous kind of conference set up, like unless you are on some kind of, tenured position or whatever. That's why it's great to have this conference for free. I also, just to briefly touch on some broader issues, I'm part of, as well as this group, also the Institute for Critical Animal Studies, and they specifically reject keynote speakers as well. And I think that's sort of a lot of the funding structures of university, of conferences, is that a lot of funding goes to those who are probably doing fairly well in many cases if you're a keynote, and so people are kind of funding them, but that can be like casual academics and that kind of thing. And so I think, I don't know if it's conscious effort or just the way things worked out, but I think it's also good not to have keynote speakers and just have everyone kind of speaking on the same level. There's also sort of with ICAS based on anarchist principles about hierarchies as well, but for whatever reason anyway, that the fact that there's no keynotes here is something I think is a good thing. But again, that's a bit of a tangent, but I thought was somewhat relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you about the no keynotes. I think something that I really like about the EAVS conferences, which I guess we'll see in the AGM if anyone now is like, we really want a keynote. But what I really like about no keynotes is I think for a lot of people, especially, now we don't have as many conferences. As you said, conferences are expensive. You have to be in positions of incredible privilege sometimes to be able to pick up and go somewhere halfway across the world, not have too many responsibilities, or be able to have people to take care of them. And anyway, it means that you don't get to meet a lot of the people that you read a lot of the time. And I think we have this kind of, I'm not going to say that you're all celebrities, the people amongst us who publish a lot, who like your work quite a bit, but you do have this kind of putting up on a pedestal of some academics. And I think there's something really nice about just doing a panel or just having papers side by side where you can have conversations that sort of level all of us and we can just discuss ideas. And it's a fruitful space to discuss things. I think time wise, I think you raised some really interesting things, Nick, and I wanted to ask about your teaching, because I think you've been teaching a little bit longer than I have. Maybe have you noticed that teaching is speeding up? Are there more time pressures? Like, do you have more students in your classes now?
I don't think I've got more per class, but I'm probably doing more. But it sort of varies semester to semester because I don't have a particular role, so it kind of varies from semester to semester. But I guess the problem of, again, not for the last couple of years, but at least most of all the rest of my teaching career, I guess, has been on a casual contract. So there often is that pressure to overload. If you get offered, you'll take it because you might not get any classes again the next semester, which hasn't happened to me yet, luckily, but there's always that idea that it could. I think just being a casual, again, not right now, but for most of the time, there's the idea, well, who knows what I'll get next semester, so I better take on some extra classes. And so obviously that means less time for the research you want to do. So I think that's a big barrier.
Absolutely. And Do you find it challenging? I'm asking this as a question, but I can speak to it as well, I think. But do you find it challenging when you're taking up all of that teaching? Because I did the same. I always overloaded. And I know we're working on another project on working in the modern university. And find that that's quite a common thing around ECRs and casualized workers. But you do tend to overload, so you have less time. How do you keep up your knowledge and things like that? Like, how do you keep up with reading? This is my struggle. How do I keep up with all of the amazing things people are writing all of the time when you have 6,000 things to do?
I would say I don't. I would say would be the short answer. Yeah, there's definitely all kinds of really interesting research, the stuff on vegophobia, or I think Corey for vegan phobia. But the research like that sounded super interesting. I haven't read it yet. I'd love to read it. And so there's so much research I come across this conference, which sounds really interesting. It's really nice to get a taste of it, but I'm definitely not on top as a literature as I'd like to be. I'm probably more on top of literature, which I teach on, which is, often, again, unless I've made an intervention to a course, is more based on human social justice issues, which is important as well. But I'd say I'd probably be more on top of the literature around race and class and gender and those kind of topics, which obviously intersects and is important to all the work we do. But I'd like to be a lot more on top of the literature around vegan sociology than I am, but it's difficult.
And how do you juggle all of the stuff that you do, like with ICAS and your activism and your podcast and your radio show and this Eve stuff that you're doing and your teaching?
Not very well either. I think it has been an issue of taking on too much for over quite a long period of time. And I think it was this idea of like wanting to be a scholar activist and not wanting to be in my ivory tower, which I'm hardly ever at as a casual academic, but this idea of, I don't want to be the person who's like an academic who helps a group with a flyer and writes it for them, and that's it. I want to write the flyer, but then I also want to distribute it at a stall or something like that. But I've also kind of reached the realization that, again, I've been doing way too much for too long. And so, I guess I've just had the realization that I have to kind of prioritize, and I guess I've, in more recent years, like I was involved with the TASA animals. I think that's really important work, but I just can't do too many things. I'm not as heavily involved in activism as I was. I definitely go along to things, but I don't organize things as much as I once did. I've kind of sort of stepped back from the activism side and the conference organizing side. And I guess the main place I see for myself is obviously doing my academic work and also doing my media work, like talking about animal issues and other social justice issues, but having to cut back on the other things. So it definitely has been too much for years.
Okay, that sucks, but I'm very impressed with all of the work that you do. I'm impressed with anyone that manages to fit it in. I know this year with TASA Animals, we're trialing a thematic group project to try to see if we can get a lot of different hands on a research project to do something that's kind of a vegan sociology thing, but doesn't take up too much of anyone's time. But the irony is that it's now been held up because I had too many things on and I haven't put in the ethics application yet. So we'll get there, but we're trying. But there's time pressures all of the time. And I think especially if you're in a university, if you've got some sort of research element to your role that has expectations around publications, particularly publications in particular places, research funding, things that you have to get done in a certain amount of time, I think that puts more pressure on vegan sociology stuff. I mean, I've had a little bit of funding for vegan sociology work, but I find that it's often the smallest amount of money that I have, right? So you don't get a lot of time. You might get 20 days to work on a project from beginning to end. And that kind of means that you're working more of your time on a lot of other things. You don't have a lot of that thinking space. I think the compression of time also affects how much space you have to think about things, which then means that it's a lot harder to engage meaningfully and have those conversations, which can be really tricky. And also just the expectations around, if you have to do 5 A-star journals, which I've not been asked to do, but I've heard anecdotally that other people have been asked to perform really highly in the A-star journal thing, which is, the highest kind of ranking of journals that we have in a lot of universities. Then are you going to put your vegan sociology articles into these really conservative, well-ranked journal articles, or are you going to put your effort into non-vegan articles that are on human issues that are more likely to appeal to a broader audience and be reviewed favorably and get into these places? And I think the neoliberalism of universities, the fact that this is speeding up, that there are kind of increasing pressures, means that you don't have time to make a lot of these decisions, and you have to very quickly decide that, you know, vegan sociology is either going to get put to the edge, or you're going to work overtime, or you're going to kind of stretch yourself too thin to try to fit it in. And those time pressures, I think, are really important to think about.
Yeah, and can I just jump in there just quickly? I think there's also, I don't know if other people have this as well, but going to a conference like this, you have so many ideas, and I was already thinking like, oh, I could write this thing. That could be a good article. But then as soon as you step away from the conference, then it's like, oh, I'm teaching and trying to write within 1 hour gaps between class or between things. It's like, as Zoe said, there's often not the time for it. So yeah, there's definitely, it's not about shortage of ideas, but yeah, time is a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
I almost wonder like where we're going to find more vegan sociologists, because as I want to say many universities are cutting the units that they view as spurious, consolidating research streams so students are only coming up through the appropriate methods of study. Are we going to get as students any opportunity to study something like vegan sociology? I suspect not, unfortunately. I mean, I know that gender studies units are being cut. Like, where does that leave vegan sociology if we're not even able to study gender? Like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And I think about this as well with the push for 3-year PhDs. I'm not sure how other countries are going, but at least where I am in South Australia, there's a real push to get people in PhDs out in 3 years. So you have to be able to complete whatever project you've got in 3 years. You can't really spread it out beyond that. Funding is very tied to that 3-year thing. And I think even when I was a PhD student, I went to conferences in Canada, and I was very aware that other people had taken kind of 6 or 10 years to do their PhDs, and just how much more knowledge they had, like how much time they had to steep in these ideas and think about this stuff, and really like their understanding was much better than mine. And it made me think about that idea of time. I remember having a tense discussion about a project I was working on because we didn't have very many days allocated to it, and I'd worked it out to work 1 day a week on this project for, say, the next 6 months, which was not a lot of days, but it gives you that thinking space. And the person I was having the discussion with was really pushing to say, well, you've only costed this many days, so can't you just do this project in like 3 months and then it will be done? They have saying no, because you need to think. Thinking takes time. You need time for it to breathe. You need to have time to coding, to think through this stuff. And I think that push to really get things done, and done quickly, and done in really compressed timescapes, it just affects how much thinking you can do. My brain feels like Swiss cheese a lot of the time, vegan Swiss cheese, but you know, it's hard to get that stuff done. Anyway, I'm talking too long. So our last question is, we've talked a lot about some of the pressures that you experience, but can you think of how we might make spaces that make it easier to do vegan sociology? Nick, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think, and I will say just on a side note from what Zoe was talking about before of, yeah, again, people have been supportive of the research, but I guess it might be different if it was actually funded by the university or promoted. Like, I guess that's where you kind of see whether like the level of that support as well. So yeah, again, I guess funding might be a bigger pressure beyond just like, oh, you're doing that research in your own time. Great. Yeah, that's good. Like, we're interested or whatever. But yeah, I guess in terms of, yeah, we're talking about I blanked out, but they're making spaces easier for vegan sociology. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is probably in terms of making our lives easier, our discipline better, those kind of things, I think that's going to partly rely on like broader changes within society. So I guess one thing we've seen with veganism is that there's a lot more coverage, and Corey clearly found that in her research. So a lot more people are aware of veganism, a lot more people are discussing veganism, a lot more people are buying vegan products, maybe more than they used to, things like that. But in terms of the research, I'm still yet to see any research that points to any substantial increase in the number of vegans in any of the countries that I've focused on. So we're still quite small in number, and that's sort of the case in broader society. And obviously academia is partly a reflection of that broader society. So even if there's a slight overrepresentation of vegans within sociology, it's still quite small. And so I guess where I'd see next would be yeah, like growing numbers of vegans. Like if we got to say 10% of people who are vegan, obviously once you got that 10%, you'd probably get a lot more because of those social barriers would reduce and that kind of thing. So I think it would just be, yeah, again, you'd find more of those colleagues of people who are not just broadly supportive of it, but actually doing that work and are fully committed to it. In a different societies, I realize we can't wait for that to happen. And there's definitely other ways we can bring about change for animals beyond individual veganism. And again, I've been speaking about that the last few years in terms of thinking about those broader shifts towards a plant-based food system, perhaps through government policy and these kind of structural issues. But yeah, I just think once we had a society that had more vegans in it, it would be taken more seriously. There'd be more colleagues, there'd be more publications and all those kind of things. So again, I kind of see that as the next progression in terms of vegan advocacy, of going from like the normalization of veganism to actually the rise of veganism, or a significant increase in number of vegans. So that's one point I'd point to.
Okay. Alex, do you have any ideas how you could make spaces to support vegan sociology?
Well, not to be too cute, but I mean, I feel like this is a pretty good initiative here. I mean, otherwise, like, I feel like we're quite lucky in sociology. We all tend to care quite a lot, and that's nice. And so I suspect maybe there is significant room to grow vegan sociology. For other disciplines, I'd say that I'd be more inclined to see growth in vegan studies in general, rather than a discipline-specific move towards veganism. But here in sociology, we like liberation, and I feel like it can grow. But as for the tangible way to do that, I don't know. I mean, I like Sarah Ahmed's concept of the feminist killjoy, and in a way, you can think about vegan killjoys, I suppose. And so perhaps we all need to be vegan killjoys in our sociology departments. Maybe that will move things along. I hope it can, but for the time being, I think initiatives like this are fantastic, because so often we are isolated in our departments. And until we can get into a space where, like Vic was saying, there are more vegans and it is well and truly a growing phenomena, online's a great medium. But unfortunately, I don't think there's a compelling answer to this in general, unless you have one, Zoe. Please hit me if you do.
And maybe before Zoe, could I just jump in I kind of made this point before, but again, I think there's kind of two key ways in terms of working within the society of as it is, in terms of both creating these spaces that like this, which is great, but also finding ways we can just speak at general sociology things too, and kind of encourage people to start thinking more critically about animals and challenge dominant attitudes, language, etc., towards animals as well. So again, I kind of see those. I've often just got the question of like, should I publish in this mainstream sociology journal, for example, and try and get those ideas kind of normalized within those spaces, or should I publish in like Journal for Critical Animal Studies, like who people are already on board? And my answer is always like both. Like it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think both of those things are like making the mainstream sociology more vegan, and also creating specifically vegan spaces where, as Alex mentioned, that there isn't that sort of emotional labor in it justifying a topic, those kind of things. But so I cut you off, Zoe, so go ahead.
Oh, I don't think you cut me off. I was probably just thinking with my mouth open. No, I think you've raised some really good ideas. I think I like the online space as well, Alex. I think there's something nice about this conference in that, I mean, all of us that have presented, we've had 25 or 35 people come to your presentation, which I've never had at an annual sociology conference, or at many conferences really. I think there's something nice about being able to not just find your people, but be able to present to experts in the field and this many people to get this much feedback and discussion, which is really valuable. But in terms of in like the physical spaces that we work, I mean, one of the things that has made a difference I didn't talk about in space is that in the college that I'm in at the moment, all of the catering tends to be vegan for things. And that's partially a climate change thing, but it's just something that if you're ordering the catering, I remember a friend of mine was organizing a conference and she just ordered all vegan food, and then they just kept doing that forevermore. And that was something that was really helpful. But I also like this idea of having kind of idea sharing. I think we have a good network here, and I'm interested to see what we do with the project, Alex, with TASA Animals, the thematic group project. Can we do more kind of collaborative work that eases the time burden a little bit? Can we buddy up with other people so that we can sort of have a buddy system and do work together and kind of lessen the load a little bit and have that motivation and accountability? Or even can we have some sort of online repository for, I saw Kate, I think, mentioned having elective courses and things like that, but just seeing like an online precedent that there are people around the world doing that, so that when you go to advocate for a course, I mean, I recently pitched a course for a job that I'm starting soon, and just being able to say, you know, back in the day, this wasn't really popular to talk about vegan sociology, but now it's everywhere. And all of these people are teaching vegan sociology courses. And look, you can see what they're doing, and you can see these activities people are doing, and you can see the ideas that people have, and you can see what ethics boards are starting to do to change to work around animals. And I think visibilizing those changes and the collective resources that we have would hopefully give us a little bit more. But I don't know. I probably just thought of this idea as therapy, so you can all tell me what to do with my life. Did anyone have questions, or shall we just keep rambling for the next 8 minutes? Because I'm sure I can. Should we have more collaboration with ICAS? Nick, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very much aligned. Yeah, I guess like the only difference being, or not the only difference, I'm sure there's other differences, but the main difference just being is that ICAS is multidisciplinary, so it's not specific to sociology, it's any discipline. But yeah, I'm trying to think if we have, but I don't know. Maybe not in Australia that I'm aware of or that I've been involved with, but yeah, there definitely could be. Definitely with ICAS, like many organization, which is why yeah, Zoe and Alex and Corey and everyone who's involved in this conference, I think, has done quite an amazing job to keep it going through the pandemic, because so many organizations have just like shut down, just lost that momentum. And that's definitely been the case with ICAS here in Australia. We've kind of had that issue going on. Hopefully we'll be more active at some point in the future, but yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a question they would like to ask?
I like Corey's story about traveling across the country to speak to 3 or 4 people. That was quite amusing, which is a benefit of online, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm interested to see if anyone's doing a hybrid well. I know we discussed doing an in-person thing yesterday. There were discussions about it. And I think I like the idea of hybrid, because I think there's something to be gained in face-to-face discussion. But I always worry that the online people are kind of going to be left out of the incidental conversations and things like that. So I'm curious if anyone has ideas of how we can create productive and sort of helpful hybrid events and hybrid collaborations. So if anyone has ideas, that would be nice to put in the chat. Otherwise, if all of our meetings are now hybrid.
Yeah, I think definitely having stuff with videos makes it a lot more engaging. I know even just like lecture content, just hearing an audio and the slides or something is not very engaging to listen to, but yeah, having something with video can help.
What about morning tea time and things? Like, has anyone done anything that is very engaging so that you can actually participate? If you're an online person, you can chat to people when you have breaks. I know ASA tried something in their last conference, which was one of those Mozilla spaces online, but I haven't seen anything else like that.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. I know I spoke to someone who was involved in more of a like a think tank kind of animal organization, and was saying that the online worked, it did the job, but I guess what was missing was those kind of incidental conversations, which are really important. And I guess thinking back to conference, like I've seen so many great, so many great talks and discussions, but probably, often the biggest thing you might get out of it is more like an informal discussion over lunch and those kind of things. So that's harder to replicate, I guess.
I mean, is it ridiculous to have just a morning tea in person for those that can make it, followed by a hybrid session where even like I've got my laptop here and then Zoe, like you're there with your laptop, and like it seems silly in many ways, but I think having that rapport with the people that you're discussing with, even if it's just for the people that can make it on the day during a morning tea, is really important, and that can open up spaces for those conversations.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Although the image of us all in a room with our laptops here and our headphones in is hilarious.
No, I do think about it because I think there's been something leveling in the pandemic, and certainly people have written about it, that when everyone's online, you're all having the same experience, which might be a less experience if you're used to going and talking to people in person, but it might also be more enriching if you're not often able to go and talk to people in person. So yeah, I always think about a virtual teacup. What is a virtual teacup, Anne?
It's an online meeting at which you bring your cup of tea and your animals, and spontaneous, no agenda, but one does emerge. If I think, especially if there are gifted conversationalists there.
Okay. So we could have virtual teacups. We kind of do that a little bit with TASA animals when we do our hive minds. That's often just an informal gathering. Does anyone else have any questions or comments about space and time for vegan sociology? Has anyone had any success in challenging the non-vegan spaces in their universities or where they're working? It's always nice to hear a success story. Well, that could be a really sad note to end on if we all just sit in silence and think. We see some change, right? Corey was hired to do vegan stuff, absolutely. I recently got a job where they were really into all of the animal research, and I just thought back to people telling me that no one would ever hire me to be an animal sociologist. Like, they'll hire you to be a sociologist, but not for your animal things. So make friends with other people about your human sociology skills. And that does seem to be changing. Oh, you got the same advice, Corey. Yeah.
I think
And
even
I
just being, oh, sorry.
There you go.
I think even just being vegan in the university space is sometimes enough to be seen as the trouble, or to be seen as the naughty kid in the corner. And like, I know in my experience, paying attention to the birds that flew in that can't get out anymore is enough to make people go, oh, hey, like that's an issue, isn't it? Whereas before it would have just been part of their day. They would have walked past and they would have seen the bird on the railway, or on the railing rather, and not considered it at all. So I think there is something to be said for the passive existence that we're enduring in these institutions, though that shouldn't necessarily be the benchmark we're aiming for.
Okay, passive existence. Well, they're saying you're vegan is a nightmare, Federica. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, it is, because when you say you're vegan, especially when it happens that when there are, like, for example, dinners after events, or buffets, or even, you know, tea time during conferences, there aren't vegan options, even though, for example, animals are the content of the conferences, very broadly intended. And when you say you're vegan, then you immediately catch the attention of the audience, but in a very bad way. And, you know, my university at the moment is very much discussing about sustainability policies. And so I sent them some documents to say, to tell that we need to talk about food at events, for example, and they didn't consider me. I said, this is a part of a discourse on sustainability practices and policies, but they apparently don't want to take it into consideration. So for me, it's really, really difficult, because I never find something to, but it's not, of course, it's not an issue about eating or food. It's about being coherent, you know? And for example, I was invited, I have a talk now next week for the Venice Biennale with an artist, a video artist that works on mourning and mourning practices and animals and gender violence. And she's very, very interesting. And she, I don't know if she's vegan or vegetarian, but she surely has a political approach. And after the event, they communicated us that they have reserved a table at a very, very important restaurant in Venice that is a fish restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked me, do you have any health issues or preferences? And when I said I'm vegan, I'm sure I won't find anything to eat there. And they said, don't worry, we'll try to accommodate you. So that's normal situation for us. So I really get very disappointed by these incoherences that I always find. in the academy.
Absolutely. And I think, I don't know if, I'm sure a lot of you have been to animal conferences where they are serving animals on the menu and also talking about why no one cares about animals. But that was my first big conference. I went overseas. We're over time now, so if you would like to take a break, please do. This is just story time now. But I always remember the first big conference I went to was overseas at Oxford University, and it was a human animal bond conference, and everyone was talking about why doesn't anyone care about animals. And I just assumed, being like a first year PhD student, very shiny and new, that obviously if you were asking that question, you'd all be vegan or at least vegetarian. There was one other vegetarian who I think ate meat on the second night. And then there was just me. And it wasn't just that I was the only vegan, it's that as soon as I said that, because they brought out the meal and said, oh, you requested the vegan one, everyone looks at you and then starts to get really weird and really distant, to the point that when we had a discussion the next day, which was brainstorming why people don't care about animals, and I said, you know, you have to think about, you know, if we're talking about companion animals, why don't you think about why no one cares about food animals and start to think about where those ideas come from, and maybe some of those are driving why we don't care about companion animals either. And the guy just looked at me and said, that makes me uncomfortable, and then wouldn't write it on the board and walked off. And I thought, oh, that's how we're going to be now. This is the context that we're good. It's disappointing at an animal conference. Anyway, that's the end of our panel. Sorry to end on a ramble.